Good morning. Page 485, Chapter 2, Part 7. Rulers change, the archipelago remains. The special camps must have been among the best loved brain children of Stalin's old age. After so many experiments in punishment and re-education, its ripe perfection was finally born. A compact, faceless organization of numbers, not people, psychologically divorced from the motherland that bore it, having an entrance but no exit, devouring only enemies, and producing only industrial goods and corpses. It is difficult to imagine the paternal pain which the visionary architect would have felt if he had witnessed it turn the bankruptcy of this great system of his. In turn, while he yet lived, it was shaken, it was given off sparks, it was covered with cracks, but probably caution prevailed and these things were not reported to him. When the special camp system began, it was inert, sluggish, unalarming, but it underwent a rapid process of overheating, and within a few years, its state was that of a boiling volcano. If the great Corinthians had lived a year or 18 months longer, it would have been impossible to conceal these explosions from him, and his weary, senile brain would have been burdened with a new decision, either to abandon his pet scheme and mix the camps again, or on the contrary, to crown it by systematically shooting all the index-lettered thousands. But amid weeping and wailing, the thinker died somewhat too soon for this. He died, and soon afterward his frozen hand was brought crashing down. His still rosy-cheeked, still hale, vigorous comrade in arms, the minister of those extraordinarily extensive, intricate, and irresolvable internal affairs. The fall of the archipelago's boss tragically accelerated the breakdown of the special camps. What an irreparable historic mistake it was. What sense does it make to disembowel the Ministry of Arcane Affairs? Lay oily paws on sky blue shoulder boards. Number patches, the supreme discovery of 20th century prison camp signs, were hurriedly ripped off, thrown away, and forgotten. This alone was enough to rob the special camps of their austere uniformity. It hardly mattered. When the bars had also been removed from hut windows and locks from hut doors, so that the special camps had lost the pleasant jail-like peculiarities which distinguished them from corrective labor camps. Perhaps they needn't have hurried with the bars, but they couldn't afford to be late either. In times like those, it's best to show where you stand. Sad though it was, the stone jailhouse at Equifax, which had held out against the rebels, was now pulled down, razed quite officially. But what could you expect if they could realize suddenly to a man the Austrian, Hungarian, Polish, and Romanian prisoners in special camps showing scant concern for their black crimes and their 15 or 20-year terms of imprisonment, and so undermine altogether the prisoners' awe of heavy sentences. They also lifted restrictions on correspondence, which more than anything had made prisoners in special camps feel buried alive. Really feel buried alive. They even allowed visits, dreadful visits. Even in mutinous Kangeer, they began building little separate houses for this purpose. The tide of liberalism swept on so irresistibly over the erstwhile special camps that prisoners were allowed to choose their own hairstyles, and aluminum dishes started vanishing from the kitchens for conversion into aluminum combs. Instead of credit accounts, instead of special camp coupons, the natives were allowed to handle ordinary Soviet currency and settle their bills with cash like people outside. Carelessly, recklessly, they demolished the system which had fed them, the system which they had spent decades weaving and binding and lashing together. And were those hardened criminals at all mollified by this pampering? They were not. On the contrary, they showed their depravity and ingratitude by adopting the profoundly inappropriate, offensive, nonsensical word, barrier-ite. And now, whenever something upset them, they would yell the insult at conscientious consulate guards, long-suffering warders, and their solicitous guardians, the camp chiefs. Not only did the word pain, the tender-hearted practical workers, it could even be dangerous so soon after Beria's fall, because someone might make it the starting point of an accusation. For this reason, the head of one of the Kangir camp divisions, by then purged of mutineers and replenished with prisoners from Ekabetsus, was compelled to deliver the following address from the platform. Men, in those few short years from 1954 to 56, they found it possible to call the prisoners men. You hurt the feelings of the supervisory staff and the convoy troops by shouting barrier-ites at them. Please stop it. To which the diminutive V.G. Vlasov replied, Your feelings have been hurt in the last few months, but I've heard nothing but fascists from you guards for 18 years. Do you think we have no feelings? And so the major promised to cut out the abusive word fascist, a fair trade. After all these pernicious and destructive reforms were made, we may consider the separate history of the special camps concluded in 1954, and need no longer distinguish them from corrective labor camps. Throughout the topsy-turvy archipelago, easier times set in from 1954 and lasted till 1956, an era of unprecedented indulgences, perhaps the period of greatest freedom in its history, if we disregard the BDZ detention centers for non-professional criminals in the mid-20s. Instruction kept instruction, inspector vied with inspector, encouraging even wilder displays of liberalism in the camps. Permission for the use of female labor in the forest was withdrawn, yet it was acknowledged that lumbering was perhaps excessively heavy work for women, although 30 years of continual use were the proof that it was not too heavy at all. Parole was reintroduced for those who had served 2/3 of their sentence. They began paying money wages in all camps, and prisoners flooded the shops, which were subject to no prudent disciplinary restrictions. And how could they be when so many prisoners were unguarded so much of the time? Indeed, they could spend their money in the settlement too if they wished. All huts were wired for radio. Prisoners had more than their fill of newspapers, and wall newspapers. Agitators were assigned to each work team. Comrade lecturers, colonels even, came to address the camp's population on various themes, even on the perversion of history by Alexei Tolstoy. But the administration did not find it so easy to collect an audience. They could no longer drive them in with sticks, and subtler methods of pressure and persuasion were necessary. There was a continual buzz of private conversation in the hall, and nobody listened to the lectures. Prisoners were permitted to subscribe to the loan, but no one except the loyalists was moved by this. And their mentors to tug each prisoner by the hand towards the subscription list and squeeze the odd 10, 1 ruble Khrushchev style, out of him. They started organizing joint shows for the men's and women's camps on Sunday. People flocked to these willingly, and many even bought themselves ties in the camp shops. Much of the archipelago's gold reserve was put into circulation again. There was a revival of the selfless, voluntary activities by which it had lived in the days of the Great Canals. Councils of activists were set up, with sectors like those on a local trade union committee for industrial training, culture and recreation, and services. With the struggle for higher productivity and better discipline as their main task, comrade courts were recreated with the right to censure offenders, to request disciplinary measures, or the non-application of the 2/3 rule. These measures had once served our leaders well, but that was in camps which had not gone through the special camp course in murder and mutiny. Now things were simpler. One chairman of Activist Council was murdered at Kingear, a second beaten up, and suddenly nobody wanted to join. Captain Second Class Berkovsky worked at this time in a council of activists, worked honestly and conscientiously, but because he was always being threatened with the knife, he was also very cautious, and attended meetings of the Banderas Brigade to listen to criticism of his actions. And still the pitiless blows of liberalism staggered and rocked the camp system. Light discipline camp divisions were set up. There was even one in Kingear. In effect, you need only sleep in the camp area because you went to work without escort, by any route and at any time you pleased. Everybody, in fact, tried to set out early and return late. On Sunday, a third of the prisoners were let out on the town before dinner, a third of them after dinner. And 1/3 were not allowed an outing. Let the reader put himself in the position of the camp authorities and tell me, could they operate in such conditions? Could anyone expect good results? One MVD officer, my traveling companion on its Siberian train journey in 1962, described this whole era in the life of the camps until 1954 as follows. Things were completely out of hand. Those who didn't want to didn't even go to work. They bought television sets with their own money. He had retained very dark memories of that short but unpleasant period. For no good can come of it when his mentor stands before a prisoner like a suppliant, with neither whips nor punishment cells, nor graded short rations to fall back on. But this was apparently still not enough. The next assault on the archipelago was a battering ram called the off-camp living out system. Prisoners were allowed to move out of camp altogether, to acquire houses and families. They were paid wages like free men, and paid in full, with no more deductions for the upkeep of the camp, the guards, and the administration. Their only remaining link with the camp was that once a fortnight they went in to report. This was the end of the world, or of the archipelago, or of both at once. But the organs of the law applauded the off-camp system as an outstandingly humane and pioneering discovery of the communist order. After these blows, there seemed to be nothing left but to disband the camps and be done with it, to destroy the great archipelago, ruin, scatter, and demoralize hundreds of thousands of practical workers with their wives, children, and domestic animals, make faithful service of rank, and an impeccable record of things, things of no account. Make faithful service, rank, and an impeccable record. record things of no account. Sorry, I can't figure out what that means. It seems to have begun already, something called commissions of the Supreme Soviet, or more simply, unloading party, began arriving at the camps, cold-shouldering camp authorities, taking over the staff hut for their sessions, and writing out orders of release as lightheartedly and irresponsibly as they were warrants for arrest, as though they were warrants for arrest. A deadly threat hung over the whole cast of practical workers. They had to think of something. They had to fight. One of two fates await any important social event in the USSR. Either it will be hushed up or it will be the subject of calumny. I can think of no significant event in our country which has slipped past the roadblock. So it was throughout the existence of the archipelago. Most of the time it was hushed up, and whatever was written about was lies, whether in the days of the Great Canals or about the unloading of commissions in 1956. As far as these commissions were concerned, we ourselves, with no insidious prompting from the newspapers, under no pressure from the outside, assisted the work of sentimental falsification. Who would not be deeply moved? We were used to attack from our own lawyers, and now we saw public prosecutors taking our side. We pined for freedom. We felt that out there a new life was beginning. We could see as much, even from the changes in the camps, and suddenly there came a miracle-working plenipotentiary commission, which talked to each prisoner for 5 or 10 minutes, then handed him a rail ticket and a passport, some of them even registered for Moscow. What, except praise, could burst from the emaciated, chronically bronchitis, wheezy breast of us prisoners? But what if we had risen for a moment above the happiness that set our hearts painfully pounding, and ourselves running to stuff our rags into our duffel bags, and asked ourselves whether this was the proper ending of all Stalin's crimes? Should not the commission have stood before a general lineup of prisoners, bared their heads, and said, "Brothers, we have been sent by the Supreme Soviet to beg your forgiveness. For years and decades you have languished here, though you are guilty of nothing. While we gathered in ceremonial halls under cut-glass chandeliers, with never a thought for you, we submissively confirmed the cannibal's inhuman decrees. Every one of them. We are accomplices in his murders. Accept our belated repentance if you can. The gates are open and you are free. Out there on the airstrip, planes are landing with medicines, food, and warm clothing. There are doctors on board. Either way, they obtained their freedom, but this was the wrong way to confer it, a denial of its true meaning. The unloading commission was like a careful janitor following the trail of Stalin's vomit, and diligently mopping it up. That was all. There was no way to lay new moral foundations for our society. I am quoting in what follows the judgment of A. Skripnikova, with which I entirely agree. Prisoners are summoned one by one, as usual to keep them disunited, into the office where the commission sits. A few factual questions are asked of each man's case. The questions are perfectly polite and apparently well meant, but their drift is that the prisoner must admit his guilt, not the Supreme Soviet, but the unhappy prisoner again. He must be silent, he must bow his head, he must be put in a position of one forgiven, not one who forgives. In other words, they want to coax out of him with the promise of freedom what previously they could not wring from him, even by torture. Why, you may ask? It is most important. He must return to freedom a timid soul, and at the same time the Commission's records will make it appear to history that those inside were, most of them, guilty, that the pictures of brutal lawlessness have been greatly overdrawn. There may have been a handsome financial benefit too. Without rehabilitation, no compensation need be paid. If it meant no more than this, the release of prisoners held no dangers. It would not blow the whole camp system sky high. It created no obstacle to new admissions, which went on uninterruptedly even in 1956-57, and no obligation to release the newcomers in their turn. What of those who, out of incomprehensible pride, refused to acknowledge their guilt to the Commission? They were left inside. There were quite a few of them. Unrepentant women prisoners in Dubrovnik in 1956 were rounded up and dispatched to the Kemerova camps. Skripnikova tells us of the following incident. One Western Ukrainian woman had been given 10 years because her husband was a supporter of Bandera. She was now called upon to admit that she was in because he was a bandit. No, I won't say it. Say it and you'll go free. No, I won't say it. He's no bandit. He is the OUN. Right, if you don't want to go, you can stay, said Solovyev, chairman of the commission. A few days later, her husband visited her on his way home from the north. He had been sentenced to 25 years, but he readily admitted he was a bandit and was pardoned. He showed no appreciation of his wife's staunchness and heaped reproaches on her. Why didn't you say that I was the devil himself, and you'd seen my tail and my cloven hoof? How am I going to manage the farm and children now? I should mention that Skripnikova herself refused to acknowledge her guilt, and remained inside for another 3 years. So even the era of freedom came to the archipelago in a public prosecutor's gown. All the same, the alarm of the practical workers was not baseless. In 1955-56, stars over the archipelago were in a conjunction never seen before. These were fateful years for it. It might have been its last. If the people who were invested with supreme power and weighted down with the fullness of their knowledge about their country had also been steeped in that doctrine of theirs, but believed in it genuinely and wholeheartedly, surely those years were the time for them to look back in horror and to sob aloud. How can they gain admittance to the kingdom of communism with that bloody sack at their backs? It oozes blood. Their backs are one great crimson stain. They have let out the politicals. But who or what has produced all those millions of non-political and non-professional criminals? Our relations of production, the social milieu, we ourselves. You, perhaps? They should have let their space program go to hell. Let Sukarno's Navy and Kwame Nkrumah's Guard regiments look after themselves. They might at least have sat down and scratched their heads. Where do we go next? Why are our laws, the best in the world, rejected by millions of our citizens? What makes them so ready to crawl under that murderous yoke? And the more intolerable it is, the more densely they flock to shoulder it. What must we do to stem the stream? Perhaps our laws are not what they should be. And here it would be worthwhile thinking a little about the harassed schools, the neglected countryside, and all those things we can only call injustices with no class label. How are we to bring the fallen back to life? Not by cheap and facile gestures like the Voroshalov amnesty, but by sympathetic effort to understand each of them, his case and his character. Should we put an end to the archipelago or not? Or is it there forever? For 40 years it has been an ulcer in our flesh. Isn't that enough? Evidently not. It is not enough. Nobody wants to tire the convolutions of his brain. There is no answering ring in his soul. Let the archipelago stand for another 50 years while we get on with the Aswan Dam and the unification of the Arabs. Historians attracted to the 10-year reign of Nikita Khrushchev, when certain physical laws to which we had grown accustomed suddenly seemed to stop operating, when objects miraculously began defying the forces in the electromagnetic field, defying the pull of gravity, will inevitably be astounded to see how many opportunities were briefly concentrated in those hands, and how playfully, how frivolously they were used before they were nonchalantly tossed aside, endowed with greater power than anyone in our history except Stalin, the power which though impaired, was still enormous. He used it like Krylov's Mishka in the forest clearing, rolling his log first this way, then that, and all to no purpose. He was given a chance to draw the lines of freedom 3 times, 5 times more firmly, and he failed to understand his duty, abandoned it as though it were a game, for space, for maize, for rockets in Cuba, for Berlin ultimatums, for persecution of the church, for the splitting of oblast party committees, for the battle with abstract art. He never carried anything through to its conclusion, least of all the fight for freedom. Stir him up against the intelligentsia, nothing could have been simpler. Use his hands, the hands that wrecked Stalin's camps, to reinforce the camps now? That was easily achieved, and just think when. In 1956, the year of the 20th Congress, the first orders limiting relaxation of the camp regime were promulgated. They were extended in 1957, the year when Khrushchev achieved undivided power. But the caste of practical workers was still not satisfied. Sensing victory, they went over to the offensive. We can't go on like this. The camp system is the main prop of the Soviet regime, and it is collapsing. For the most part, their influence was, of course, brought to bear discreetly, at official banquets, in the passenger cabins of aircraft, at dasher boating parties, but their activities sometimes came out into the open, as, for instance, in V.I. Samosonov's speech at a session of the Supreme Soviet, December 58. Prisoners said he lived too well. They are satisfied with their food, whereas they should be permanently dissatisfied. They are treated too well. In a parliament which had never acknowledged its earlier guilt, no one, of course, rebuked Samsonov, or in the article about the men behind bars in 1960. Yielding to this pressure, without examining anything closely, without pausing to reflect that crime had not increased in those last 5 years, or that if it had, the causes might be sought in the political system, without considering how these new measures could be squared with his faith in the triumphal advance of communism, or attempting to study the matter in detail, or even to look at it with his own eyes, the Tsar, who spent all his life on the road, light-heartedly signed the order for nails to knock the scaffold together again quickly, in its old shape, and as sturdy as ever. And all this happened in the very year 1961, when Nikita made his last expiring effort to tug the cart of freedom up into the clouds. It was in 1961, the year of the 22nd Congress, that a decree was promulgated on the death penalty in the camps for terrorist acts against reformed prisoners, in other words, stoolies, and against supervisory staff. Something which had never happened, and the plenum of the Supreme Court confirmed in June 1961 regulations for 4 disciplinary categories in camps, Khrushchev's camps now, not Stalin's. When he climbed onto the Congress platform for another attack on Stalin's tyranny, Nikita had only just allowed the screws of his very own system to return no less tight, and he sincerely believed that all this could be fitted together and made consistent. The camps today are as approved by the party before the 22nd Congress. 6 years later, they are just as they were then. They differ from Stalin's camps, not in regime, but in the composition of their population. There are no longer millions and millions of 58s, but there are still millions inside, just as before. Many of them are helpless victims of perverted justice, swept in simply to keep the system operating and well-fed. Rulers change, the archipelago remains. It remains because that particular political regime could not survive without it. If it disbanded the archipelago, it would cease to exist itself. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.